Namaste, good morning, and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our Sunday service. Om Om Yo Brahmanam Vidadhati Purvam Yo Vai Vedangscha Prahinoti Tasmai Tam Hadevam Atma Buddhi Prakasham Mumukshur Vai Sharanamaham Prapadye. We who seek liberation take refuge in that infinite light which illuminates the hearts of all, who is the source of the Creator himself and the source of the infinite knowledge, Veda. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om Peace, Peace, Peace be unto us all. So this morning is your morning. That is, I didn't have to prepare a talk for today. Today is question and answers, and so it's a time for your questions and my attempt at answers to your questions. And so several people sent in very good questions for this morning's session. And I think there will be enough questions to easily fill the hour. But if there are more questions, you can type them in the comment section on YouTube. And if there's time, I will get to those as well. But we'll start with the ones that people sent in. And so again, this is not just easy for me because I don't have to prepare a talk. You prepare it for me. But also it's something that I enjoy doing because I get to see what it is that you want to know, or where there might be points that need clarifying. And so it's good for me, and I hope that it is also useful for you. So I'll just jump into the questions because, again, we do have several. And so the first question is, when can someone be considered a Hindu? I have heard that many Orthodox Hindus believe that only those who are born into the faith and go through the traditional rites of passage are true Hindus. Could you please share your thoughts or experiences with this? Yes, and that's a question that's very dear to my heart because obviously I was not born a Hindu, and yet I consider myself very much a Hindu. And yet in India, many people don't consider me such. Hinduism, like Judaism, has for a long time been an ethnic religion. It's something that you are born into. And so if your parents and grandparents, and for as many generations back as you can see, and theoretically to the Vedic age, if your ancestors were Hindu, then you are Hindu. Otherwise, you're not. And that's the sentiment of many nowadays. But on the other hand, there are many non-Indians who have come into the Hindu fold. And so what are they? If they're not Hindus, then what are they? Well, I've had people tell me, even some of our own monastics tell me that, well, you're a Christian. I said, well, no, I'm not a Christian. I was born into a Christian family, but I haven't been a practicing Christian since my youth, since my teenage years, when I learned about Vedanta. And I said, yes, but you're not a Hindu, you're a Christian. And so I realized then that the idea in India is that whatever you are born into, that's what you remain. And so this monk who was telling me that and he's a very good monk and a very good and dear friend of mine. So no criticism of him. I'm just using his ideas as a launching pad for this discussion. He came from a Jain family, and so he said he still was a Jain, though he was a Hindu sannyasin, but he was a Jain because that's what he was born as. And he said even from his youth he didn't practice Jainism. He was not close to the tradition, but that's the tradition he was born into. But he had been very fond of Swami Vivekananda and of Vedanta and followed that, and he was already a sannyasi. And yet he said, well, but I'm a Jain, and so you are a Christian. So the idea there is that you are born into a religious identity. But that is not the idea of either Christianity or Islam or Buddhism. There are Christians, most Christians, the vast majority of Christians today are people who were born into a Christian family. The vast majority of Muslims were those who were born into a Muslim family. The vast majority of Buddhists were those who were born into a Buddhist family. But Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam were missionary religions, religions which didn't start with a native population. The first Muslims were people who chose Islam. The first Christians were people who chose to be followers of Christ, and thus Christians. The first Buddhists were people who chose to follow the Tathagata, the enlightened one, the Buddha, and thus became Buddhists. And so even today, to become a Buddhist, you take the three refuges: Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Dharmam Sharanam Gacchami, Sangam Sharanam Gacchami. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in his Dharma, his teachings, the principles of Buddhism, and I take refuge in his Sangha, his community of Buddhists, at the center of which is the monastic order. And so that's what one does to become a Buddhist. One affirms one's refuge in the three jewels, as they are called. To become a Christian, you take baptism. You go to a particular Christian denomination. Of course, in the early centuries of Christianity, there was just Christianity. And there might have been different streams of thought within Christianity and some different streams of practice, but there was one Christian church. But gradually, the Christian church divided into non-communing denominations, non-communing sects, that is, exclusive sects. And so now if one wants to be a Christian, one goes to a Christian denomination of one's choice and seeks baptism. And through baptism, you become a Christian, and through the affirmation of faith in Jesus as one's Savior. To become a Muslim, similarly, one accepts the basic principles of Islam, that there is no God other than Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. And the Quran is the source of revelation. So by accepting the principles of Islam, one becomes a Muslim. By accepting the principles of Christianity, the most basic principles, and baptism, one becomes a Christian. And by taking the three refuges, one becomes a Buddhist. So a Buddhist is not a Buddhist because they were born into a Buddhist family. A Buddhist is really a Buddhist from the standpoint of the tradition itself, because they have taken refuge in the three jewels. And so with Christianity and Islam. Ethnic religions, like the various Native American religious traditions, because each tribe within the Native Americans had their own cultural religion as part of the tribal life. It was like Hinduism in that it was not separated out from daily life. It was the way of life of the tribe, which pointed towards a spiritual source. And so one is born into a Native American tradition, one is born into the Jewish tradition, one is born into the Hindu tradition. And so among Jews, there is a debate about whether one can become a Jew if one does not have a mother who is Jewish. As in Judaism, the religious tradition is passed down matrilineally. It's if you have a Jewish mother, then from a standpoint of Judaism, you are Jewish. And so many Jews, many Orthodox Jews, and some others say that one cannot convert to Judaism. But there are many others who do accept the idea of conversion, and of course we have had many people who convert to Judaism. So with Hinduism, the basic idea is that one is a Hindu if one is born of Hindu parents. And so as with Judaism, you find many cultural Hindus who were irreligious or a-religious. They're not religious at all. They don't believe in the Vedas. They don't believe in the rituals or in images or so forth. But they're born into a Hindu family, and so they are cultural Hindus, as there are cultural Jews who don't go to synagogue, who don't read the scripture, who don't practice Jewish practices, but they are cultural Jews, so cultural Hindus. But that was not always the case in India. Hinduism spread from the Mediterranean world all the way to the Philippines, through Southeast Asia and the Philippines. How could that happen from Vedic India, that Hinduism could spread through all of these countries and those countries could become Hindu? Cambodia is said, and I don't know if it's true, I've been there, but I don't know if it's true or not, but it's said that there are more Hindu temples in Cambodia than in any country outside of India, even though the country for the last 5 centuries has been Buddhist, but it was a Hindu kingdom. It became a Hindu kingdom. And so with the rest of Southeast Asia, including even Vietnam, had a Hindu past. Indonesia was Hindu, and it reached all the way to the Philippines, some of the islands of the Philippines, and then in the west through Afghanistan, all the way to Syria in ancient Vedic times, so that some of the Egyptian pharaohs, they preferred Hindu princesses from the kingdom, the Mitanni kingdom, which is on the edges of Syria, the borders of Syria. So those who say that one has to be born of Hindu parents to be a Hindu don't know their own history, because that was not always the case. Hinduism spread quite widely, even though it was never a missionary religion. There was never the impetus in Hinduism of going out and conquering new lands for the Dharma. But Hindu traders went out far and wide, and through their influence, people took up the Hindu religion, and whole nations became Hindu. And for many centuries were Hindu. And so you still find the remnants of that all through Southeast Asia. And then you find pockets like in Bali, in Indonesia, where the country of Bali, or the sub-country of Bali, the island of Bali, is still a Hindu country, far, far from the borders of the nation state we know as India today. So how does one become a Hindu? Some will say that you can't. You have to be born, die and be reborn in a Hindu family, then that's the way to become a Hindu. If your karma is good enough, then you'll be born as a Hindu. That, of course, I don't believe, because I consider myself very much a Hindu. I've been through the various rites of Hinduism. I've been through mantra diksha. I received the Gayatri mantra, which I recited. I had the Upanayana, the sacred thread, and then took Hindu sannyasa. And so my life since I was 19 has been Hindu. And so I certainly consider myself a Hindu, whether everyone else does or not. That doesn't matter to me. And so my belief is that a Hindu is one who, first of all, accepts the Vedas as the repository of spiritual principles. It doesn't mean that you have to accept everything in the Vedas, because the Vedas are vast literature with all sorts of things. They have magic, they have black magic, they have white magic, they have spiritual principles, they have rituals, they have everything imaginable. But one who accepts, for instance, with me, being a Vedantin, I accept the Upanishads as the sources of inspired truth, the statements of inspired truth. And the early part of the Vedas I accept as a historical evolution towards the Upanishads, themselves full of inspired truths, full of inspired vision of truth, inquiry into truth, searching for the truth, but that culminating in the flowering of the Upanishads, where the full truth was revealed and taught. And so one thing that makes one a Hindu is one's relationship to the Vedas. Again, it doesn't have to be the orthodox idea that every word of the Vedas is eternal and that the sages only heard the words of the Vedas and recorded them, but no one wrote them. No, I take a much more modern view of the Vedas, as did Swami Vivekananda, where he said that by Veda no books are meant, but Veda means the repository of infinite knowledge, all of the principles governing spirituality and this universe itself. In the light of which definition, even physics and biology become part of Veda. The linguistics become part of Veda. The truths of the nature of this universe and its source in the ultimate reality, which is spirit. All of those principles cumulatively that have been discovered and yet are to be discovered are Veda. And that many of those principles are, not all of them, but many are enshrined in the books we call Vedas. But the devotion is to the principles. So accepting the Vedas, and then the four basic principles of Hinduism, and this is mainly Vedantic Hinduism, because there are other schools of Hinduism which don't accept all of these four, or don't put these four principles in the same way. But Vedantic Hinduism, which is by far the predominant form of Hinduism, in fact, practically all Hindus today, if they're practicing Hindus, are followers of some form of Vedanta. And that is that this universe has a spiritual source, that this universe has come out of a spiritual reality. It's founded in that spiritual reality. It rests within that spiritual reality. It never loses its connection with the spiritual source. And so the different schools of Vedanta have different ways of explaining that, but all of them accept that this universe comes out of a spiritual reality, known often as Brahman. Second principle is that within each being there is a spiritual principle known as the Atman, the spiritual self, the real self, beyond the body and mind, but which manifests through the body and mind and gives life and awareness to living beings. So that there is a spiritual reality behind this universe, which is the source of this universe. There's a spiritual reality within each living being, called the Atman. And the third principle is that the purpose of life is to realize that divinity outside and inside. And fourth is that all different religions are different paths leading to that realization. This was not something that was established just by Sri Ramakrishna. He realized it in an extraordinary way for the first time we know in human history, through living different religious traditions all the way to their realization. But it was a principle enshrined all the way back in the Vedic times, continued through texts like the Bhagavad Gita and the Shiva Mahimna Stotra and other texts as a central tenet of Hinduism, that all different religions are different paths leading to the reality. So if one accepts those four principles, then one is, at least in sympathy, one is, and by choice, one is a Hindu. And then what about a conversion ceremony? Well, there's not a conversion ceremony, but some, for instance, in India, some have developed conversion ceremonies for those who want to come back to the Hindu fold in India, those who were converted to other religions but want to return to the Hindu fold. Then there are ceremonies that have been developed for bringing them back in. So basically accepting the truth of Veda, the infinite knowledge, which is the foundation of this universe and everything within it. And then one way of showing one's commitment to Hinduism, that I am going to be a Hindu from now on, is by taking initiation from a Hindu teacher. Then one enters into a lineage of teachers and disciples within the Hindu tradition. And especially if one takes the Gayatri Mantra and recites the Gayatri Mantra, the holy prayer the most holy and universal prayer from the Vedas. So taking the Gayatri Mantra and then following the teachings of a teacher, that would, in my estimation and the estimation of many others, makes one a guru. But this idea that one can only be born of Hindu parents to be a Hindu, that idea, the sooner that goes, the better for the tradition, because it's not the ancient tradition. Again, whole countries were taken into the Hindu fold. Shankaracharya, when he went to Central Asia, he blessed a whole mass of people there and turned them into instant Brahmins so that they could carry on the Hindu tradition. They were not in the Hindu fold, but he brought them into the Hindu fold. And again, that was a problem that Swami Vivekananda faced, because he taught Westerners, he accepted Westerners as disciples, but there were many back in India who questioned him and said, how can you teach our religion to mlechas, that is the barbarians, that they're not born of Hindu parents? How can you teach them the Om and yoga and all of that? So Swami Vivekananda said, all of my disciples are Brahmins. All of my disciples are Brahmins, meaning that they are the best of the Hindus. so he had no use for that limiting of Hinduism. Those are my thoughts on that. So next question. This one has a bit of explanation, but the explanation I think is important. You mentioned, meaning me, you mentioned once that the reason tradition feels like such a burden is because we, people of average intellects, are unable to distinguish the milk from the water, so to speak, in what has been passed down. Your comment about the difficulty of separating the truly important practices from the unimportant fluff resonates with me 100%. The sentiment in me presently is to err on the side of excessive practice rather than on the opposite. Two extremes are readily apparent to me. One, embracing tradition completely and unquestioningly, including the regressive attitudes in tradition. Two, cherry-picking acceptable practices as per convenience, which has the very real danger of dilution of practice. I know the ideal path lies somewhere in the middle, but I am having difficulties in determining how to carve out a niche on this spectrum. Giving up tradition altogether seems to me to be pretty counterproductive, as a new tradition with more or less equally questionable validity often replaces the old, as in the case of the Buddhists, as you commented in last week's Sunday service. So I am convinced of the necessity of tradition in theory, but I am confused about tradition in practice. So yes, this refers to my talk in which I spoke about tradition and how tradition has a great value, but tradition can also become a burden to us. That is, tradition has a value in that by belonging to a tradition, by entering into a tradition, we enter into a family of followers, as it were. We have a context in which to follow. We have traditions that have come down for centuries and maybe for millennia, depending on the tradition. Practices and observances that have been tried and proven in the experience of many people. But I also said, as the questioner points out, I also said that that can become a problem with tradition as well, because a tradition picks up a lot of fluff along the way, a lot of chaff along the way, which begins to burden society. For instance, I'll give an example from Christianity and an example from Hinduism, but these examples are just indicative of what every tradition faces. Every tradition has this problem. So in Christianity, there's the great debate among Christian denominations about whether women should be ordained or not. For instance, women cannot become priests in the Catholic Church, and of course not bishops or pope or anything like that. And in some Protestant traditions, women cannot become ministers. And so one evangelical American minister said disparagingly that asking women to preach the gospel is like asking a hen to stand up on a fence post and crow like a rooster. They can't do it. So, first of all, let me say that's not my opinion. That's his opinion. I don't agree at all. But his opinion is that women, of course, they cannot preach the gospel, because can a hen crow like a rooster? Well, I don't know that crowing like a rooster is necessary for preaching the gospel. And so that's a silly idea. And more serious ideas are, in traditions like in the Roman Catholic Church and some of the Protestant denominations that don't accept women, is that Christ was a man and his disciples were men also, and it was men that he sent out into the world. And so that's just the way it is. That was established by Christ himself, so we have to preserve that. Women cannot become priests or preachers of the gospel, at least not official ordained preachers of the gospel. So that, to me, is a problem that Christianity faces, and Christianity will have to resolve in its own way. It's not for me to resolve, but that's an example of something that has become enshrined in tradition, which, as an outsider, which to an outsider like me, seems like a completely unnecessary problem. Society was different in the days of Jesus. Things and attitudes have changed a great deal. And to say that only men can be priests or ordained ministers, that is a silly limitation. And so with Hinduism, that to be an officiating priest in a temple, one has to be from a Brahmin family. So there are many traditions within Hinduism that guard caste privilege and so forth. There are movements within Hinduism, and there always have been movements in Hinduism, religious movements from inside of Hinduism for reform and for opening Hinduism beyond the limitations of caste. But as in all traditions, every single tradition of the world, there are those who want to hold to all of the traditions as sacred without distinguishing between those that are helpful and those that are harmful. And so you find in India that there are schools for training the lowest members of society, the so-called outcasts or pariahs, to train them in being temple priests. There are schools in India for teaching women to be temple priests and so forth. Those are very good signs in which the tradition is being opened up beyond the caste distinctions. And so that's those are examples of the types of ideas that are carried down by tradition, which in time become chains on the feet of the tradition, and they keep the tradition from adjusting to modern times. And as I said in a recent class, there's the tradition in yoga, pranayama, where you're supposed to do pranayama, closing this nostril with the thumb and this nostril with these two fingers. Now, Swami Vivekananda, he had his iconoclastic side. That is, he was an icon breaker. And so when he taught pranayama, he taught the simple way of just like this and like that. That is a practical way. A way identified purely with practice. Now, those who follow the traditions of yoga will say, well, no, it was always taught like this because the energy in these two fingers is different from the energy in that finger, and these two fingers have these properties, and that finger has that property, and so these fingers should be used. But those things, yes, maybe that has some value, but it's a if there is any value to it, it's a very minor value. If you can do pranayama like this, then it's not that you're not going to get the results of pranayama. You'll get them just as well as if you did it this way. So again, Swami Vivekananda realized that in tradition there are many things which are very good, but there are many things that come down which are harmful and regressive, as the questioner here has used the term very well. So, as he says, there are two extremes. One is to adhere too rigidly to every dictate of tradition, and another is to cherry pick the ones that you like. And as the questioner says very rightly, there is a problem with both. So, rigid adherence, that becomes a fanaticism, where there's only one way of doing it, and that's what the scriptures say. And if you read the Dharma Shastras, the texts on the law books of Hinduism, the Hindu law books, and you find that everything that you're supposed to do in life is spelled out in great detail and how you're supposed to do it. Much like in the law of Judaism, the Orthodox Jews, they follow the law in the Jewish Bible to the letter, about what type of cloth you should wear, what you should eat and not eat, how you should eat, how you should prepare food. Everything has a directive, that the way that you're supposed to do everything. And so you find that Orthodox Jews generally live in communities where they can facilitate the practice of all of these observances among themselves. Otherwise, it gets to be extremely burdensome. If you're out in open society, trying to live a strictly Orthodox life. And so that also becomes a burden. If everything that you do is defined and every move that you make is you're supposed to do it this way, then it removes the creativity and the ability to solve problems, because you're always looking to see, okay, what am I supposed to do here? What am I supposed to do there? To give an example from the thought world, once I met some young seminarians. They were from a junior seminary, a Roman Catholic seminary. They were in junior high school, but they were on their way to becoming priests as young men, 13, 14 years old. Of course, they had the choice later to opt out, but the natural course of things was for them to become priests. So I was interested in them and what they were doing. This was back a year before I joined the order, so I was already interested in spirituality and religion. So I asked them some questions, and they gave answers from their tradition. And then I asked them one question, which I forget what it is, and they looked uncomfortable and looked at each other, and then they said, we haven't learned the answer to that one yet. And so I realized that what they had been telling me were fixed answers for questions that they had been taught to anticipate. And when they got a question they had not anticipated, they didn't know what to say. And so, these are middle school students, so I'm not picking on them. How many middle school students could give any adequate answer to religious and spiritual questions? So again, not to pick on them, but that's endemic of what happens when a tradition decides everything for you. I once went to one of our centers in this country where there was a Swami, a very great Swami, and one of his disciples who was staying there in the ashram for some months. He told me one day, we are so lucky to live with Swami so-and-so here. He even tells us when to tie our shoes. And so my first thought was, why do you need a guru, a great guru, an illumined guru, to tell you when to tie your shoes? Can't you figure that out for yourself? And so when a tradition tells everybody everything about when to tie your shoes and what sort of shoes you should wear and all of that, it leads to degeneration. So that's one side, the side where tradition decides everything. The other side is, I'll just take what I like. The problem is that I'm choosing what I like with a unillumined mind, and I don't know really what is good in the tradition and what is not. There may be many things in the tradition I don't understand which look useless to me. So I might throw them out just because I don't understand them and don't think that they're any good. So cherry picking also is not the solution to the problem. So what is the problem? Oh, let me bring in another point that he makes here in the question, a very good point, that giving up a tradition altogether. and taking to a new tradition, that doesn't, or even making up a new tradition. We'll make up a new tradition with our own rules that seem right to us. Well, that also doesn't work. First of all, because we are making up something new, or you find a tradition like Buddhism, which rejected Hinduism, rejected the Vedas, rejected the traditions of Hinduism, and started a new tradition based on the teachings of the Buddha. But they developed their own traditions with their own limitations and their own blind spots and so forth. And so you're in the same situation because it's the human situation. So now coming towards my version of an answer, and this won't satisfy everyone, which is okay. But all I can do is give my solution to the problem here, to the dilemma, and that is that learn a tradition, learn the various well, no, instead of giving it in an abstract system where it would be very difficult to explain, let me give a more concrete explanation. I've thought many times about the puja. I've done puja for many, many years. I don't do it now, but I did it for 11 years in San Diego every day, full puja, and got great benefit from it. But I've thought a lot about the need for developing the puja in a way that it speaks to a Western audience, because the symbols in the puja were developed in Indian culture, and they speak to Indian culture, they come out of Indian culture. And so the puja needs to be adapted so that it speaks to audiences in other parts of the world, perhaps in every civilization, every cultural world. There will be different ways of doing the puja eventually. So an American way, a Northern European way, Southern European way, etc., Russian way, etc. But to do that, the rituals come out of lived experience and living symbols. They're not something that a committee sits around and invents. The traditions around the puja have come out of the cultural experience of the Hindus, which developed for thousands of years. And that's why the symbols speak to people, even if most people today don't understand deeply what's going on in the puja. They have a sense that this is holy because they've grown up with it, they've seen it, and powerful, and it is powerful. So my solution for that, how to adapt it to different cultures, is that first a person has to immerse themselves in the puja itself. Because when I first learned the puja, I found it very interesting and I found it inspiring, but I didn't really understand what I was doing. I was going through the motions. And if at that point I had decided, well, I'm going to adapt it to Western use, I would have made a mess of everything because I didn't really know what I was doing. But after many years of immersing myself in the Hindu worship, then gradually I began to see ways that the symbols can evolve and speak to a different type of audience. Not that I have done that. I would like to do that, but not that I have done that. I've thought a lot about it and developed in my mind ideas, but I haven't put them into practice. But that's the sort of thing that if one immerses oneself in the tradition, then from the inside you see, oh, this does this and that does that, and this means this and that means that, and they fit together like this. This is tied to that, and that's tied to that. You begin to understand the system from the inside as a world of experience, and then you can begin to translate it. But if you start by cherry picking just the things that you like, yes, you'll throw out many things. Let me give another example from the realm of ideas, not of orthodox practice, but the realm of ideas. When I first came and heard about the 5 elements, space, air, fire, water, and earth, the 5 traditional elements out of which this universe has come, it sounded like primitive science, meaning superstition to me. I thought, well, that's a silly idea to be teaching Westerners. Do we know about the periodic table of chemical elements? They're not 5 elements. They're many more than that, and they're on the periodic table of chemical elements. And so at that time, when I was new for the early years of my spiritual life, I would have said that, well, let's forget about the 5 elements. We should throw them out. That's meaningless. Modern science has clearly shown that that's not the way the world is made. But later, with deeper understanding, I realized that no, the 5 elements are based on a profound analysis of experience, quite different from the way of dividing the world into chemical elements. But there's a profound truth, experiential truth enshrined in the idea of the 5 elements. And so something I would have thrown away as superstition, I find now is highly meaningful. And so with other ideas that I encountered when I first came, that I thought, well, this is a silly idea. Who needs that? And later I found that no, that was a profound idea. So yes, just cherry picking ideas, throwing out what I don't like from a superficial standpoint, that won't work. But through practice, through study, we gradually get a deeper understanding of what is true and what is just something superfluous that's along for the ride with the tradition. It's just kind of fell into the tradition, or it was dragged along in the tradition, and no one ever thought to brush it away. Uh, so let me say one other thing about that, that there are things that we look at, for instance, this with doing pranayama with these 2 fingers as opposed to these 3 fingers for pranayama, for closing the nose, the nostrils. Maybe there is something to this. So I wouldn't say throw that away, but at the same time, I would say don't make that a dogma, that the only way to do pranayama is like this. It may be that in time, people will find that this is just as good. It may be in time, people will find that, well, this is even better for such and such a reason. So don't just throw out things wholesale, but at the same time, be somewhat contingent. That is, be discriminating about what to keep in practice and what not to keep, analytical, but not absolute. So the absolutism of one side, that every single detail should be adhered to, and the absolutism on the other side, that only what I like should be kept and everything thrown away. Both of those should be avoided. So there's not a simple answer that these are the things to accept and these are the things not to accept. What I would say as my simplest answer is study the aspects of the tradition that you're interested in. See what the tradition says is the traditional practice and observance and so forth. Do as much of that as you would like to do, and see what the effects are. And then gradually you begin to develop a sense that this is something which is essential, this is something which is not so essential. But that can't be done from the beginning with an uneducated mind. It takes education to begin to see what is. And one other thing that's very important, I should certainly mention, that the example, as in all things, the example of great souls. And so by reading the lives of Sri Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, Swami Vivekananda, and the direct disciples, we get a better sense of the essences of the essential points of the tradition, and those things which are not essential. Many pointers in Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Holy Mother. And we find that even among them, there's a difference. Sri Ramakrishna observed even details of astrological beliefs in Hinduism about certain things that you should not do on certain days and certain times of day and things like that. Swami Vivekananda and Holy Mother generally didn't observe any of those things. And so even among those 3, you find differences. But by studying them, we begin to get a sense of what are the essentials of spiritual life. So through the familiarity with great souls, then we find what they considered to be essential and what they considered to be non-essential. That together with our own experimentation. So another question. You replied to one of the questions in one of the classes recently that Shirdi Sai Baba and Neem Karoli Baba are saints and not avatars. I read or heard somewhere that Ramana Maharshi said that an avatara has a purpose in his life and a jnani does not have any purpose. What is the identifying mark of an avatara? How can I, an ordinary person, differentiate between a saint or jnani and an avatara? Is there any difference in the attainments for the devotees following a saint or a jnani and an avatara? So that's a very good question also. The difference between an avatara, that is an incarnation of God, and a saint or a jnani, one who has attained to enlightenment. But like us, started out as an ordinary person, a jiva, as we call an ordinary person, living being, an ordinary jiva who attained through effort to realization, as opposed to an incarnation who incarnated from a state of perfection. And so, how to tell the difference? What are the characteristics of them? Ramana Maharshi's comment is profound as always, and he says that an avatara is born with a purpose. And that is true. The avatara comes to earth with a purpose. That is, they are already identified with God, and yet they enter into human birth willingly, purposefully, with a mission. That's why in Sri Ramakrishna's life, you find that gradually his idea of mission was awakened in him. And then everything in his life followed that purpose that he had, the purpose for which he was born. He was always afraid that his disciples, like Swami Vivekananda in particular, what if Swamiji passed away early before fulfilling his mission? Sri Ramakrishna had this sense that no, there is the mission of the Divine Mother which must be fulfilled. And this life must be preserved, his own life must be preserved until that is fulfilled. That's why he was very particular about the contact with other people that he had, because he realized that the karmic effects of other people on him had a profound effect on the purity of his person. And so he had to protect himself in order to get to the end of, to fulfill his mission, so that he could, so the whole purpose of his incarnation could be fulfilled. And you see in Swami Vivekananda that in Sri Ramakrishna's lifetime and after Sri Ramakrishna's lifetime, Swamiji didn't want to accept any purpose. He wanted to remain in samadhi, just in a state of enlightenment, as a jnani typically does. He didn't like the idea of having a purpose. And Sri Ramakrishna on his deathbed wrote that Narendra will teach others. And Narendra saw that and said, no, I won't teach others. And then Sri Ramakrishna gasped out, your very bones will make you do it. And that's what happened. Swamiji, after Sri Ramakrishna passed away, Swamiji tried again and again to lose himself in eternal meditation, and he couldn't do it. And then he realized that, no, I have a mission to fulfill also, which my teacher has left me with, and I will have no rest until that mission is completed. So Swamiji himself had taken birth for the fulfillment of a mission. And so an incarnation, yes, is born with a purpose. And that is loka kalyana, the welfare of the world, but in a way that is meant for the world in that particular time. And so Sri Ramakrishna's life and activities and teachings were different from those of Krishna or Rama or Sri Chaitanya or Buddha or Jesus, because he was addressing the problems of our time. But that was a mission. Whereas a jiva like us who attains to enlightenment, we have attained that is our purpose. And so as Ramana Maharshi said, the jnani, the realized soul who's not an avatara, the jnani, the difference between a jnani and other people is that the jnani has no sankalpa. That is, they make no intention that I'm going to do this. I have to do this, I have to do that, I'm going to do this. There's no sankalpa. The mind is completely free No desire arises in the mind. Swami Nirvanananda, our own Swami Nirvanananda, the disciple of Swami Brahmananda, who is a realized soul, as he told someone that no desire arises in my mind. No desire ever arose in his mind after his illumination. And so, what are other ways that we can know? Because that's very subtle. Unfortunately, all of the ways are subtle. But one of the things is that it's said that the ideas of an incarnation begin to spread of themselves, even without conscious teaching of the followers. That the ideas of that an incarnation brings into the world as part of their message, you find those ideas beginning to spring up in different places, seemingly of themselves. And I could give many examples of that, of Sri Ramakrishna's ideas as they have, for the last 100 years, been increasingly springing up in different places of themselves. The same with the ideas taught by Swami Vivekananda, which were not different from Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, but which we associate more with him because they were part of his public teaching. These ideas spreading in amazing ways that I've watched for more than half a century now and seen evidence that, yes, those ideas are beginning to spring up in surprising ways of themselves, with even in places where no Swami or other devotee has been to teach. So and then the incarnation. Another difference is that in incarnation, their influence lasts for many centuries, and oftentimes for millennia, but at least for many centuries. In their lifetime, many people are liberated by their influence, and after their lifetime, people continue to be liberated through their influence. Whereas a illumined soul may help a few people in their lifetime, help them to attain to enlightenment, as we see in the life of Ramana Maharshi. There are various people, Shirdi Sai Baba, but taking just one example, Ramana Maharshi, there are a number of people who came to him, some who attained to a great spiritual advancement and some who attained to enlightenment through the influence of Ramana Maharshi. And even now people study his words and so forth. But the difference there is that one who follows someone like Ramana Maharshi, you feel an inspiration, great light on the path by studying their life and their words and so forth. And through that, one might attain to illumination. But with an incarnation, one feels that it's through the grace of the direct grace of the incarnation that illumination has come. If I worship an incarnation, I feel that they have illumined me. It's not their example, it's not their teaching, it's not the tradition they left behind, but they themselves are lifting me up. It's their grace itself, their personal grace, conscious, aware grace that I feel lifting me up. And so that's another a difference, that the jnani, the saint, leaves a tradition, leaves a holy influence, leaves an atmosphere perhaps in the place where they lived, leaves associates that were perhaps attained illumination through their grace and their help. But then the tradition lives on more as a memory. But with an avatara, the tradition lives on through the living power of the avatara, who continues to inspire the movement, and people continue to feel the grace of the person of the avatara. So, how to tell which is an avatara and a jnani? Well, that's difficult. But with time, we begin to tell. And one of the things is that if we have the chance of living around highly spiritual people, that's a very rare chance. Very few people get that chance in life. But if we have the chance of living around several highly spiritual people, we begin to get a sense of what spirituality itself is. And then, though we ourselves may not have attained to great spiritual heights, we begin to have something to distinguish between genuine spirituality and just a show. Like, I've met people who claim to have attained to Nirvikalpa Samadhi many, many years before. And they give their autobiographies and so forth and tell about when they attained to Nirvikalpa Samadhi and so forth. And meeting them, I see that they don't have anything spiritual. They may be good people, they may be well motivated, but they felt that they had to pretend to have had Nirvikalpa Samadhi in order to get a following, and they wanted to have a following. But not because of my great insight, but because of the fact that I had the great blessing of living among highly spiritual people. And I saw what they were like and the type of influence that they had. And then I see these people and see that, no, it's just pretense. That's just pretense. In many cases, I've met holy people also outside of the Ramakrishna mission. Of course, there are many in all traditions, but I've met many who pretend to be illumined gurus who are not. Let me get another question here. While covering page 374 of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, there must be 274, you provided commentary on two topics that I want to learn and understand. I have gone over that particular lecture many times and request further elaboration. How to realign our sense of agency where Sri Ramakrishna becomes the focal point of everything we do, and how to surrender to Sri Ramakrishna properly. And then how do we know that Brahman is of the nature of Ananda? So I'm going to try to answer this briefly. It's very good questions with actually three parts, but I'll answer it very quickly because I took much more time on the earlier questions and now the time is up. So how to realign our sense of agency where Sri Ramakrishna becomes the focal point of everything we do. The best way to do that I know are twofold. One, to learn to address our thoughts to Sri Ramakrishna as often as we can. And it's a great help to keep pictures in the home that we can look at. Like here in the temple, I have, of course, the benefit of living in a temple. And so when I come out of my room, there's the image of Kali and an image of Durga and Saraswati, Lakshmi, and Ganesha and Kartik, and then Shiva and Ramakrishna, Holy Mother, Swami Vivekananda. So every time I come out of my room or I go into my room, I salute and direct my mind, not just automatically salute as a habit without thinking about it, but direct my mind towards them. And so by directing one's mind towards Sri Ramakrishna multiple times during the day, learning to pray to Sri Ramakrishna, learning to salute him in your comings and your goings, learning to ask his guidance, learning to ask him to protect you, asking him to guide you, asking him that you grant me refuge. I take refuge in you. Please protect me, guide me. Gradually, we learn to include Sri Ramakrishna or Holy Mother, whoever our chosen ideal is, but we'll say Sri Ramakrishna as a fill-in for one's chosen ideal. Ask Sri Ramakrishna for his guidance, for his grace, for his protection, for his sustenance, etc. And gradually we get used to doing that, and we begin to feel that we are depending on Sri Ramakrishna. Why is it that the Buddhists say every day, and many of them say multiple times a day, Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, Dharmam Sharanam Gacchami, Sangham Sharanam Gacchami. I take refuge in the Buddha, in his Dharma, and in his Sangha. It's because again and again you want to remind yourself that that is my ideal, that is my sustenance, etc. And so doing the same thing to Sri Ramakrishna, but thinking that we're talking to Sri Ramakrishna, directing the mind to Sri Ramakrishna as someone who is listening to me, communicating with me, listening, who can hear my words and who can respond. So learning to do that. Then how to surrender to Sri Ramakrishna properly, that's the same basic question. How do we know that Brahman is of the nature of Ananda, bliss? Brahman is Sat, Chit, Ananda. Not that those are three different things, but Sat is Chit is Ananda, which is Sat again. Existence is awareness itself, which is bliss. So we can understand existence, that everything, that isness is the reality of Brahman. Brahman is, that we can understand. and we can meditate on the isness of everything. That isness is the very being of Brahman. We can understand consciousness eventually. With a little work, we can get a sense of consciousness and understand that everything is just an appearance in consciousness. And Brahman is that infinite consciousness without any modification, just awareness itself, consciousness itself. We can get a feel for that. But bliss, the world doesn't feel so blissful, and we most of the time don't feel so blissful. so we have a sense of abiding existence. We have a sense of abiding consciousness, but abiding bliss, no, we don't have that. And so bliss is it's a good question, because bliss is harder to get a feeling for. It's easy to meditate on existence, easy to meditate on consciousness, but bliss, we don't really have that intuitive sense of everything is bliss. And we shouldn't try to feel bliss all the time, because then we're just hyping up our emotions, our sentimentality, which is not healthy for the mind or person. So if we can understand that, that I'm aware that I am, and that the closer I come to that, the more I will experience bliss. That it's not easy to analyze that philosophically, but experientially we can see that the more expansive I become in my sense of self, that I am existence itself, I am consciousness itself, dwelling that thought, I begin to feel joy. And gradually joy comes. So we don't start with understanding Ananda as the nature of Brahman, except theoretically, but we get to it through experience. So even though existence, consciousness, and bliss are the same thing, we are so constructed that right now we understand something of existence and consciousness, but bliss seems to elude us. And so we have to go closer to that reality, and then we begin to see that awareness itself is bliss, existence itself is bliss, though it doesn't seem so now. So there we need a practical answer. We can't go beyond that. There won't be time for more questions, Sudhiji. Okay, but I've still got 2, 3 more questions. Okay. So, okay. So Hindu cosmology explains how space, air, etc. were created. However, there is no mention about how time was created. Why is it so? Is time being considered part of space itself? So yes, in the usual cosmology, you find that cosmology proceeds by the appearance of substance, that Brahman appears as the cosmic intelligence, and that cosmic intelligence appears as the lower levels, grosser and grosser levels of experience, till we get to the physical universe. And so time is not pictured in that. But at the same time, in Hindu cosmology, especially in the devotional cosmology, time is Shiva himself is said to be time. Kali herself is said to be time. And so time was not often delineated as the creation of time, but as soon as you have movement within pure consciousness, when you have Brahman, there's no movement, there's absolute stillness. Absolute stillness, absolute knowledge, no process whatsoever. There's no time, because there's no process. But time means what? Time means change. Time is the perception of change. The perception of time is the perception of change. And so the very moment that you have manifestation, from the first moment, the first movement of manifestation, there is time. And so time is the way that manifestation takes place. So most of the cosmology deals with things, how this evolved into that, which evolved into that, which evolved into that. But the whole thing is dependent on time. And so Shiva dancing and Shiva still in meditation. Shiva in still meditation is the absolute. Shiva, when Shiva begins to dance, that is the beginning of time. Because as soon as you have movement, as soon as you have vibration, as soon as you have manifestation, that is time itself. So it's a very good question. And then in the Isha Upanishad, this is a very simple question, a good question, but a simple one. In verse 15 of the Isha Upanishad, where the dying soul requests the golden orb of the sun to be removed. The dying soul looks at the sun and says, "O sun, please remove apavranu, remove the golden orb that hides your face, so that I, who am devoted to the truth, may perceive you." And Sri Ramakrishna's cutting down of the form of Ma Kali with the sword of knowledge to reach Nirvikalpa. Are they similar? Yes, I think that's a good point. That Sri Ramakrishna, when he was being taught the Advaita, non-dualism, by Totapuri, Totapuri told him to concentrate his mind and to break through the realm of the relative and plunge into the absolute, into Brahman. And Sri Ramakrishna said every time he concentrated his mind, the beautiful, enchanting form of the Divine Mother Kali would appear before him. And Kali, who to him was reality. Don't think that Sri Ramakrishna saw Kali as a mental image and he just couldn't get rid of the mental image. No, he saw Kali as reality itself. More real than this, more real than this. He saw the living Divine Mother Kali. And so then Totapuri took a piece of glass and stuck it between his eyebrows so there'd be a point of pain and said, "Fix your mind on that," and cut through the image. So Sri Ramakrishna again went into Samadhi. Saw the all-enchanting, world-bewitching image of the real Mother Kali. Mother Kali standing before him as reality itself. And Sri Ramakrishna took the sword of discrimination and cut through the image and was plunged into Nirvikalpa Samadhi, into the absolute Brahman. And so, yes, there is a similarity between that and the dying soul asking that the beauty of the orb of the sun, the glorious shining orb of the sun, be removed so that I can see the face of truth. So yes, there. I think a comparison can be made in that. So now let me just very quickly see about this. How does why does it seem that enlightened masters only lived in the past? Are there masters in the world today, but we don't have the karma to recognize them or be in contact with them? Yes. You answered your own question that is true. There are always illumined souls. It's said in the Hindu tradition, it's said in the Jewish mystical tradition, and other traditions, that there are always some illumined souls in the world. Otherwise, the universe would devolve into chaos. That there are always some who are in contact with reality, who have realized reality. And so recognizing them and finding their company, that's the difficulty. There are many people who claim to be realized, but don't believe that just because somebody puts a sign up saying realized soul residing here. No, it's difficult to find, and their company is very difficult to access. And last, how does repeating Om as part of meditation lead to connectivity with the infinite? Because that's the meaning of Om. Om is the totality. And by meditating on Om, it's the first movement of manifestation. And so it leads us back to that which is before manifestation, to Brahman. So Om, as we meditate, repeat Om and meditate on it, we should think of it as totality, as wholeness, as everything, as the concept, as reality itself. And so it leads us back to that. And in Jnana Yoga, while discriminating neti in the attempt to cross the frontier from mind to pure consciousness, the two seem mixed up. Can we distinguish the two without yogic samadhi? So while discriminating neti in the attempt to cross the frontier from mind to pure consciousness, the two seem mixed up. We can only distinguish the difference between mind and pure consciousness in a very high state. That takes a yogic samadhi or samadhi before we can see that. That's what the Yoga Sutras themselves say, that when the mind is perfected in samadhi, then one perceives the distinction between mind and pure consciousness. And then one can identify with pure consciousness and leave the mind behind. So that's only at the heights of spiritual life. Okay, so that's all of the questions. So thank you for all of the very good questions this time. I appreciate all of your questions, and I'm sorry that there was not an equality of treatment. I spent more time on the first ones, and there wasn't much time to deal with the last ones. But I hope that I got some sort of understandable answer to the other questions as well. So let me give announcements, and then I'll give a closing prayer. On Tuesday, we will continue with the study of the Katha Upanishad at 7:30 in the evening, Tuesday evening, live streamed. On Thursday at 11 o'clock in the morning, we will continue with the study of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And on Sunday, we will have the usual Sunday talk. I haven't come up with a topic yet, but we will send out an announcement this week with the announced topics for June. And then also among announcements, let me mention again that on June 13th, which is a Sunday, 2 weeks from today, in place of the talk, we won't have a talk here, and it won't be live streamed, nor will there be a talk held here in the auditorium. We will have an open house at the new retreat, the Trinity Retreat. We sent out a notice yesterday. In fact, I sent out 2 notices because in the first one I forgot to mention the date. So I had to send it out again with the date. So that will be on Sunday, June 13th. It will begin at 12 o'clock, last until about 2. The people who want to stay longer can stay longer. We'll have a picnic lunch. We'll have a guided meditation, sort of as a blessing of the land. To tell you about our plans for the property and just let you have a tour of the place to see the property. So we hope as many of you as possible can come. But we do need for you to register at Eventbrite. So in the email that we sent out, there is a link where you can register, and already a number of people have registered on Eventbrite so that we can plan for the logistics for the picnic lunch and parking and all of that. So the other announcement is that after that, our classes and lectures here will be open to the public. We will have spaced seating in here, and we ask that only people who have been vaccinated come for now. Until more people are vaccinated and the pandemic is well under control, then only we'll allow everyone in for the lectures. But for now, to keep the lectures safe for everybody, only those who have been vaccinated. So we encourage people to take the vaccination and not to be subject to the various conspiracy theories which are flying out there. But unless you have a compromised immune system which advises against the vaccination, we encourage people to get it. So with that, I'll give the closing prayer. Om madhuvatartayate madhuksharanti sindhavaha madhvirna santoshadhihi madhunaktamuto shasi madhumatparthivagum rajaha madhudyaurastu nafmita madhumandho vanaspatir madhumagum astu suryaha madhvirgavo bhavantu naha. Om madhu, om madhu, om madhu. For us who seek the truth, and for all living beings, may the winds blow sweetly, may the rivers flow sweetly, may the herbs yield us sweetness. Sweet be the night and the break of day, sweet be the very dust of the earth. May the heavens pour down sweetness upon us. May the trees, lords of the forest, bear us sweetness. May the sun shed its sweetness upon us. May all the directions pour forth sweetness. Om, sweetness, sweetness, sweetness.